1/5 of all the oil on Earth passes through a single stretch of water. That's the Strait of Hormuz. And China, the world's biggest oil importer, sends half of its entire energy supply through it every single day. Now imagine what happens if that strip ever gets disrupted. China has been imagining that for years. And it's been quietly building a solution that most people have never heard of. The dependency problem. China is the largest importer of crude oil on the planet. Every single day, it pulls in roughly 11 million barrels of oil from around the world to keep its factories running, its cities lit, and its economy the second largest on Earth moving forward. And about half of that oil comes from one region, the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Oman, Kuwait. Now, all of that oil has to travel somewhere before it reaches China. And the fastest route, the route almost every tanker takes, goes through the Strait of Hormuz. According to the US Energy Information Administration, 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products pass through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That's roughly 1/5 of everything the entire world consumes. And here's the part that keeps energy planners up at night. More than 84% of all the oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz is heading to Asia. China is the single biggest destination. So what China has, essentially, is a supply chain where its most critical resource, the fuel that powers its entire industrial machine, must pass through a single, narrow, 1 mile wide gateway every time it needs to be delivered. Energy experts call it a choke point, and the Strait of Hormuz is the most important one on Earth. The problem with choke points is simple. They are fragile by design. A single disruption, a shipping accident, a regional dispute, even a spike in insurance costs can ripple through global energy prices within hours. China knows this better than anyone. And, for the past decade, it has been working on a plan that could change this equation entirely, not just for China, but for the entire global energy map. The plan is called the Gwadar-Kashgar pipeline. And to understand why it matters, you first need to understand a small port city on the edge of Pakistan that most people have never heard of. The port that China built from almost nothing. On the southwestern tip of Pakistan, right where the Arabian Sea meets the edge of the Persian Gulf, sits the city of Gwadar. 20 years ago, it was a quiet fishing town. A few dusty roads, small boats, a handful of markets. Today, it looks like something out of a master plan, because it is one. China identified Gwadar early as one of the most strategically placed locations on the planet, and here's why. Gwadar sits just 50 miles from the Iranian border, and only a few hundred miles from the mouth of the Persian Gulf, the source of much of the world's oil supply. Compare that to the current route. Right now, when Middle Eastern oil is loaded onto a tanker bound for China, that tanker sails out through the Strait of Hormuz, crosses the Arabian Sea, passes through the Strait of Malacca between Malaysia and Indonesia, and then travels north through the South China Sea before finally docking at a Chinese port. That journey covers roughly 10,000 kilometers. Now, imagine instead that the tanker stops at Gwadar. The oil is unloaded there, at a deep water port right next to the Persian Gulf, and then sent overland directly north into the heart of China. The distance? About 3,600 kilometers, less than half. That is the core idea behind what China and Pakistan have called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. A massive infrastructure network, roads, railways, power lines, and eventually pipelines connecting Gwadar all the way up to Kashgar in China's western Xinjiang region. China has already invested tens of billions of dollars into this corridor. Roads have been built, power plants have come online. A brand new international airport opened in Gwadar in January 2025. But the crown jewel, the piece that would truly transform the whole project from an interesting infrastructure story into a global energy game-changer, is still just a proposal. The oil pipeline. And building it turns out to be one of the most complicated engineering challenges ever attempted. The $10 billion dream, what the pipeline would actually do. Here's what the Gwadar-Kashgar oil pipeline is designed to be. A 1,087-mile underground corridor, roughly the distance from London to Moscow, carrying crude oil from the coast of Pakistan, up through the Karakoram mountain range and into China's Xinjiang province, where refineries would process it and distribute it across the country. At full capacity, the pipeline is designed to carry up to 1 million barrels of oil per day. That's enough to fill over 150 Olympic swimming pools every single day. The estimated cost to build it is around $10 billion. And the potential payoff is enormous. China's oil would no longer need to travel 10,000 kilometers around Southeast Asia. It would arrive from a port sitting right next to the world's biggest oil-producing region through a direct underground route, in far less time and at far lower cost per barrel. The journey from the Persian Gulf oil fields to China's refineries would shrink from 10,000 kilometers to roughly 3,600 kilometers. That's not just a shorter route. For a country importing 11 million barrels every day, that difference in distance translates into billions of dollars saved every single year. And here's the part that makes this more than just a cost-saving exercise. An underground pipeline doesn't sail through choke points. It doesn't need to navigate disputed seas. It doesn't slow down when shipping insurance costs spike. It just flows quietly, steadily, underground, regardless of what's happening on the surface of the world. For China, that kind of energy security is worth almost any price. But there's one thing standing in the way, quite literally, a mountain range. The Karakoram range is not a mountain range you can casually build through. Home to some of the highest peaks on Earth, including K2, the second tallest mountain in the world. The Karakoram sits between Pakistan and China like a wall, built by nature specifically to make this project as difficult as possible. And the numbers tell the story. From where the pipeline would start at Gwadar port on the coast, to where it would cross into China at the Kunjarab Pass on the border, the elevation gain is more than 4 kilometers straight up. That's like starting at sea level and climbing to the top of a mountain taller than anything in Europe or North America, while simultaneously building a pressurized oil pipeline the entire way. Here is what that actually means for engineers. Crude oil is thick, heavy. It doesn't want to flow uphill. At altitude, temperatures plunge far below freezing. In extreme cold, crude oil doesn't just slow down, it starts to thicken, almost like cold honey, until it stops moving entirely. A pipeline full of solidified crude is not just useless, it's a multi-billion-dollar disaster. To push oil over passes like Kunjarab, engineers would need pumping stations, massive facilities placed every 75 miles or so along the route, powerful enough to keep the oil moving uphill against gravity and temperature simultaneously. For just the Gwadar to Kashgar section alone, a 2013 engineering assessment from Pakistan's National University of Computer and Engineering Sciences calculated that 14 separate pumping stations would be required. Each one would need to be built, powered, maintained, and secured in terrain where roads barely exist and weather can make access impossible for months at a time. And then there's the construction challenge. You can't drive heavy machinery through passes that sit 4,700 meters above sea level. You can't lay pipeline in active avalanche zones using standard equipment. Every section of pipe, every valve, every pumping component would have to be transported through some of the most remote terrain on Earth, often by helicopter or by mule, and assembled on site by workers operating in conditions that push human endurance to its limits. Then there are the softer challenges. The pipeline route passes through Balochistan, Pakistan's largest but most underdeveloped province, a region that has struggled for decades with poverty, political frustration, and instability. Development projects in this area have faced repeated setbacks. Between 2021 and 2024 alone, 14 separate incidents targeted infrastructure projects along the CPEC corridor. Chinese engineers working on CPEC-related road projects have had to be accompanied by more than 15,000 Pakistani security personnel. The 893-kilometer M8 highway, a key road connection that would need to exist before any pipeline is viable, has been under construction for more than 10 years and still isn't finished. This is why the pipeline, first announced with a planned completion date of 2018, has not been built, but the mountain and everything that comes with it has been winning, at least for now. Why the world is watching anyway. Here's the thing about the Gwadar-Kashgar pipeline. Even unbuilt, it is reshaping how countries think about energy, because what China is trying to do, build an overland energy corridor that bypasses every maritime choke point in Asia, is the template for the future of global energy security. Think about it from China's perspective. Right now, roughly 45 to 50% of China's entire crude oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz. That's not a comfortable position for a country that needs energy security the way a human being needs oxygen. China has been responding to this in several ways simultaneously. It has built one of the largest strategic petroleum reserves on Earth, estimated at around 1.2 billion barrels as of early 2026, enough to cover roughly 108 days of net imports. It has diversified its suppliers, bringing in more oil from Russia through overland pipelines that don't touch any ocean at all. It has invested aggressively in domestic renewables, planning to more than double its energy storage capacity, from 73 gigawatts to 180 gigawatts by 2027, and it has kept the Gwadar pipeline dream alive. In 2026, China and Pakistan reaffirmed their commitment to CPEC under a second phase, CPEC 2, with Gwadar port development and the Karakoram highway upgrade listed as priority projects. The new Gwadar International Airport, which opened in January 2025, is part of this broader vision. Build the surrounding infrastructure first, prove the corridor works, and make the pipeline financially viable later. The Lowy Institute, one of the world's leading geopolitical think tanks, has called the pipeline economically unsustainable in its current proposed form. The engineering costs are enormous, the security challenges are real. The port at Gwadar still cannot receive the world's largest oil tankers. But analysts also say this: China has a track record of building things that everyone said couldn't be built. The Three Gorges Dam, the world's largest high-speed rail network, the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge, the longest sea crossing on Earth. Each of those projects, at some point, was described as too expensive, too ambitious, too difficult. And yet they exist. The Gwadar-Kashgar pipeline doesn't yet. But the question for global energy markets is not whether China will abandon the idea. The question is, what happens to the global energy map the day it finally decides to push through? If you made it this far, that genuinely means a lot. Videos like this one take hours of research to get right. If this kind of storytelling is worth something to you, there's a link in the description where you can support the channel whatever feels right. Even just a few dollars helps keep the next one coming. No pressure at all. And either way, thank you for watching. So let's land where we started. 1/5 of the world's oil, 21 miles of water. China imports 11 million barrels of oil every single day, and roughly half of it passes through that 2 1-mile gap. The Gwadar-Kashgar pipeline is China's answer to that. A $10 billion underground energy highway, 1,087 miles, over one of the most extreme mountain ranges on the planet. Sitting in that fascinating space between ambition and reality, where the world's biggest infrastructure stories are always born. But here's what I keep coming back to. The CPEC corridor, the roads, the power plants, the port, the airport, all of it was also once just a proposal. And piece by piece, it got built. So the real question isn't whether the mountain can be crossed. The real question is, what does global energy look like the day it is? We just saw what happens when China tries to build through a mountain. But what happens when it tries to build under an entire sea? Same ambition, same engineering scale, completely different problem. That story is right here, and I think it might be even more extraordinary than this one.